Welcome everyone, thank you for coming. My name is Weyler and today I would like to present my work about vision-based semantic scene understanding for agricultural robots. And before we dive more deeply into the specific terms of this title, I would like to start with the brief motivation about the work that I've been doing in the last few years. And for this, let us start with the fact that the world population is ever increasing and that this growth correlates with an increasing demand for food and feed. Now, to keep pace with these growing demands, we also need an increase in overall yield, and ideally we achieve this in a sustainable way to not harm the ecosystems that we rely on as humanity. And one of the most important tasks towards keeping the yields high is the process of weed control in crop fields. Now, when we have a look at conventional farming, this process here relies on a procedure where agrochemicals are spread uniformly over the entire field. And this has the advantage of having a very high throughput, but on the contrary, it also causes negative impacts on the ecosystem in the long term, for example, soil degradation and loss of biodiversity. So we can conclude that this conventional method that I have presented so far is not a solution that we can rely on in the long run, and this raises the question, how can we make weed control and other agricultural processes better to achieve a more sustainable and effective crop production? And one potential solution to this task is to deploy agricultural robots that are equipped with one or multiple cameras, and based on the sensor information we can, for example, detect individual weeds in the field and then remove them autonomously by deploying mechanical or thermal tools or selective spraying approaches. In contrast to the previously shown uniform treatment of entire fields, these actions here can be performed targeted and autonomously, so they are more sustainable and scale also well to large agricultural fields. Another promising solution is to deploy drones that are also equipped with cameras, and the main idea here is to capture multiple overlapping images over the entire field, which we can then process to generate such a global field map here. Once we have such a field map, we can then exploit it to analyze the current field status in more detail. For example, here we can quite easily identify crops that are in an unexpected growth stage, or also areas with an increased weed pressure. So to conclude, automating such an analysis here also offers the potential towards a more sustainable agriculture, since it allows us to first analyze the entire field and then take only actions when and where it's really needed. Now, a very essential requirement to bring both previously shown solutions into practical applications are methods that can automatically understand the content of an image. So we are really in need of methods that can tell us for such a single image here where the crops or the weeds actually are, or what the growth stage of a specific crop actually is. And we denote the process of understanding the content of an image as semantic scene understanding, and once we have this understanding, we can feed it to downstream tasks such as autonomous weeding, as we have seen before. And with this, I come to the main contributions of my thesis, where I developed several methods that can automatically obtain a semantic scene understanding of individual images captured from agricultural fields with an increasing level of understanding. And the first method that I'm going to present today tackles the task of semantic segmentation, where we want to automatically assign each pixel of an image to the class crop, weed, or background. Next, I will present an approach that extends on the previous one by simultaneously identifying individual plant instances that are shown here by differently colored masks, and this information is, for example, important when we want to perform a specific action or analysis of a specific plant, and it's well known as panoptic segmentation. Lastly, I will present an approach that again extends on the previous one by simultaneously identifying individual leaf instances of crops that are also shown here by differently colored masks, and we will see later in this talk that this information is essential to determine the growth stage of individual crops, and refer to this approach as hierarchical segmentation. However, let us first start with semantic segmentation, where we want to automatically assign each pixel and image to the class crop, weed, or background by using a semantic segmentation model. And nowadays, most state-of-the-art methods deploy convolutional neural networks for this task, where the general architecture looks as following. So we have an input image that is passed to the so-called encoder, which computes a spatially very compact but expressive representation of the input image, and its output is passed to the decoder, which recovers the spatial resolution and provides us with the final semantic segmentation. Now, these networks here usually consist of a lot of parameters that we first need to set in a proper way to obtain reliable predictions for the task at hand. And since these networks fall under the umbrella of data-driven methods, the very first step towards optimizing the parameters of such a network is to gather a so-called training dataset. And this dataset consists of a bunch of images for which we have corresponding dense ground truth annotations, and that means for all the images here, we actually already know in advance for each pixel to which class it belongs to. And these annotations here are usually obtained in a manual fashion, which is a kind of time-consuming process. However, once we have such a data set, we can exploit it to optimize the parameters of our network, which is denoted as the training process. And specifically, at the beginning of the training, the parameters of such a network are just randomly initialized, and this means the model provides us at the beginning with a random prediction for each pixel, which are highlighted here in the pink box. Now, during training, we can exploit our training data set to compare the current prediction of the model with the corresponding ground truth annotation. And specifically, we use here the cross-entropy loss function for this comparison that compares for each pixel individually the current prediction P of a specific pixel with the corresponding ground truth annotation Y of the same pixel. And this function obtains a low value if they match and otherwise a high value. So this means by minimizing this loss function here, we can effectively optimize the parameters of our network, which we do in an iterative fashion. And once we start the iterative training procedure, we can see here how our model is getting better and better over time for the task at hand, and it starts to predict the correct classes for individual pixels. Now we perform the training over the entire training data set, which usually takes quite a while. However, also after some time we can see that the model starts to converge, and this means we can fix our model parameters, save the model, and deploy it on new incoming images for which we do not have any ground truth annotations available. Now, the performance of these models is usually quite high, as long as the input images are kind of similar to the ones that we have in our training data set. For example, when we pass this image here to our previously trained model, we can see that it performs quite well, as it predicts the correct class for the crops, but also for the weeds. On the contrary, the performance of such a model can decrease quite dramatically when we deploy the same model on images that were captured at different fields under very different conditions. For example, when we pass this image here to the same model as before, it performs quite poorly since it predicts the wheat class for most of the crops here. So we can conclude that the generalization capabilities of such a model are quite low, which makes it really difficult to deploy such a model in a real-world application, and that is something that I would like to address in the following. However, first of all, we see two main reasons for this drop in performance. The first one is that our training data set is in general quite limited regarding the diversity of intra-class content it contains, and that means, for example, that crops can appear in a wide range of different growth stages, and thus its different visual appearances may not be well covered in our training data set, leading to a drop in performance. The second reason that we see is that our training data set is in general also quite limited regarding the diversity of image styles it contains. For example, the image on the right side here was captured under artificial lighting conditions by a ground vehicle, and we can see that the color of the soil and the vegetation is quite different to the colors that we have in our training data set, leading also to a drop in performance. So next, I would like to address the question, how can we effectively diversify our training data set to obtain models with highly increased generalization capabilities? And I think the most obvious way to achieve this would probably be to just collect a very diverse set of images from a variety of fields captured under a variety of conditions, then annotate all of these images and just include them in our training procedure. However, we already discussed that the ground truth annotations are usually obtained in a manual fashion, which is really a time-consuming task and nothing that you are eager to do by yourself, and this means we often have no access to these annotations here, which presents us with an annotation bottleneck. On the contrary, just the process of collecting a diverse set of images is usually a feasible task, and for example, when you ask people in the scientific community, they are usually willing to share their raw images with you, even though they cannot provide any annotations for them. So then, the next question is, how can we exploit this diverse set of images during training, given that we have so far no ground truth annotations for them available? And specifically for images that are captured from conventionally cultivated crop fields, we actually have some prior knowledge that we would like to exploit to include these images during training. Specifically, we know here for the crops in these images that they are sown in rows, and this enables us to automatically generate annotations for a subset of pixels, which we denote as sparse annotations. And in the following, I would like to present our procedure to obtain sparse annotations for the class crop and background in an automated fashion. And for this, let us start by selecting a random image captured from a conventionally cultivated crop field where we have obviously a lot of crops, but also a few weeds that are highlighted here by different colors. And the very first step we can do relatively easy is to apply some heuristic to this image to automatically obtain a binary vegetation mask where all pixels belonging to vegetation are indicated by white pixels and all the remaining pixels are just black. And we can also see here that inside the vegetation mask we still have the crops, but also the weeds, and currently we have no way to distinguish them. That is why in the second step we perform a half transformation based on the previously computed vegetation mask, which enables us to extract the most dominant, approximately vertical line, and this line actually corresponds to a crop row, which we can quite easily convert to another binary mask where all the pixels that live along the crop row are shown here in white and the remaining pixels again in black. Then, in the last step, we can restrict our vegetation mask from the first step based on the previously computed crop row mask by applying a logical conjunction between both of them. And by this procedure, we obtain a restricted binary vegetation mask where only the vegetation pixels survive which live along the crop row. And for these pixels, we are quite confident that they belong to the class crop, and we can also see here that the vegetation pixels belonging to weeds are eliminated in the restricted vegetation mask. So by this procedure here, we can automatically generate sparse annotations for crops and background, where background basically corresponds to any pixel that lives along the row but does not belong to vegetation. Now for the remaining pixels to the left and right of the row, we do not have any annotations available, so these annotations here are indeed sparse. And we consider the sparseness during training by computing the loss function only for the subset of annotated pixels, which we can then minimize as before. So this means basically any prediction that lives not along the crop row is essentially just masked out. And when we include these additional images during training, we can present our model with a high variety of different crops captured at different growth stages, so we can effectively increase the intra-class content of our training dataset. What is still left is to also diversify the amount of image styles in our training dataset, and for this we propose here an approach to transfer the style of any image captured from any agricultural field where we don't have any annotation, shown at the top left, to any image in our training dataset where we have a corresponding annotation, shown at the bottom left. And specifically, we use a whitening and coloring transformation, which takes both images as input and provides us as output with a stylized image that has exactly the same content as the image in our training dataset, but color-wise it looks much more like captured in the conditions of the image without annotation. And also here, the next question is how can we exploit the stylized image during training? And I already said that the content of the stylized image does not change, so we can still use the ground truth annotations of our training dataset and perform the training as we already discussed. And when we include now all of the previously discussed images in our training procedure, whether they have dense or sparse annotations, we obtain a new model with a new set of parameters, and when we deploy this new model to new incoming images, we can see that its generalization performance is highly increased. For example, when we apply our new model to the image where the previous one performed poorly, we can see that it performs much better since it's predicting most of the pixels belonging to crops or weeds correctly. And this is something that we can not only see qualitatively, but also quantitatively when we compare against different baselines. And for this, let us first investigate the performance of a conventionally trained model that was trained on images captured at a field in Bonn, where conventionally means here that this model does not use any sparse annotations or stylized images. And as expected, the performance of this model is quite high when deployed on the field in Bonn, but when we deploy the same model on fields located in Zurich or Stuttgart, the performance decreases by quite a lot. On the contrary, when we deploy our model, we can see that it generalizes much better, specifically on the field in Zurich and Stuttgart, while suffering only a little bit on the field in Bonn. And when we compare against two other baselines that also aim to achieve more robust predictions, we can see that on average our model performs best across all field locations. Now, to summarize semantic segmentation, I presented here a model that can automatically assign each pixel in an image to the class crop, weed, or background, and we contribute here by exploiting images without manual annotations during training to substantially increase the generalization capabilities. And now that we have a reliable model for semantic segmentation, we can move towards our second method that tackles the task of panoptic segmentation. And essentially, we know so far for each pixel in an image to which class it belongs to. However, we do not know which pixel corresponds to which plant instance. And this also means that we can currently not demand an agricultural robot to perform any specific action or analysis on any specific plant, which is why we're in need of a model that can also identify individual plant instances that are shown here by differently colored masks. And when we solve both of these tasks here simultaneously, this is well known as panoptic segmentation. And also here, more state-of-the-art methods deploy convolutional neural networks to address this task, where the general architecture is quite similar as before. So we still have our input image that is passed through the encoder, but now we have two different decoders. The upper one still performs the semantic segmentation that we already discussed, but the lower decoder is new and responsible for segmenting individual plant instances. And since the amount of plant instances in an image is highly variable, segmenting them is a bit more evolved, so I would like to explain how we design the output of this decoder in more detail. And for this, let's assume we pass this image here to our model. Then the lower decoder should provide us for each pixel with a prediction of a two-dimensional offset vector that points towards the centroid of the plant instance it belongs to. So for example, this pixel here, here, and here belong to this plant instance here, which is why the offset vectors point towards its centroid. And this allows us to group all the pixels that belong to a specific plant. Now, here I show only a subset of offset vectors for two specific plant instances to keep the illustration more clean. However, a real prediction of the network results in a two-dimensional vector field that contains offset vectors for all instances as it's shown here. Now, once we have such a predicted vector field, we can then exploit it to recover individual plant instances by applying a simple post-processing procedure. And for this, we can just start with the predicted vector field. And the first thing we can do is to apply the offset vectors. And this means we just shift each pixel xi along its corresponding predicted offset vector vi towards the tip of this vector, which results in so-called spatial embeddings, shown here by blue dots, where embeddings that belong to the same plant should form a cluster in two-dimensional space. We can then feed these embeddings to a clustering algorithm that essentially identifies these clusters, and these clusters actually correspond to the plant instances that we are looking for. Now on the left side here, we see a vector field that we would like to obtain, but as before, we first need to set the parameters of our model in a proper way to obtain such predictions. And for this, we need again a training dataset that looks quite similar as before, but now beside the annotations for semantic segmentation, we also need for all the plants in all the training images corresponding binary instance masks, where white pixels here indicate pixels that belong to a specific plant instance. And of course, we can also illustrate all plant instances of a specific image altogether by just illustrating them here in different colors. Now, as before, these annotations here are usually obtained in a manual fashion, which is again quite time consuming. However, once we have these annotations, we can also again exploit them to optimize the parameters of our network. And specifically during training, we initialize the parameters of the network such that the predicted offset vectors are just 0 at the very beginning. And then we define again a loss function that compares the currently predicted vector field with the corresponding ground truth annotation. And I will not go into the details of this loss function here. For now, it's only important that this is a function which we can minimize to optimize the parameters of our network, which we do again in an iterative fashion. And once we start the training procedure, we can see here how the predicted offset vectors point more and more towards specific centroids. And as before, after some time, the model starts to converge, so we can fix the model parameters, save the model, and deploy it on new incoming images where we do not have any annotations available. However, as you can imagine, obtaining all of these mask annotations in the training dataset for all the plants in all the training images is really a time-consuming task and nothing that you are eager to do by yourself. And this means obtaining these dense instance annotations here is really often not feasible in the first place. So we are again faced with an annotation bottleneck that I would like to address in the following. Specifically, it would be much more feasible to annotate only a few plant instances in each training image. So for example, given the training image here, we would like to annotate only 2 or 3 plant instances with their corresponding semantics, as well as a few semantic annotations in the background, indicated here by the blue blobs, and we denote such annotations as partial annotations. And it turns out that we can still train the model that we have discussed so far with such partial annotations, so we can still compute all the loss functions for the annotations that are available. However, when we deploy a model trained with partial annotations, we can see that the offset predictions do not really generalize well to all the instances. And that means for the annotated instances, we obtain offset vectors pointing towards their associated centroid, but for instances without annotation, the offset vectors are way more fuzzy and do not really point towards a specific centroid. As a result of this, also these spatial embeddings do not form well-defined clusters, and thus recovering instances with our post-processing procedure is not possible. We can also show this issue in a more illustrative fashion and state in general that for all instances with annotation, we obtain proper offset vectors pointing towards a specific centroid, but for instances without annotation, we do not. So we can conclude that we need more constraints on the vector field during training in case of partial annotations, specifically for the offset vectors of instances without annotation. And this is actually not straightforward, since the main question is how can we tell our network during training what a good or a bad offset prediction is, specifically for these areas here where we do not have any annotation. And in the following, I would like to present how we encourage our network to predict proper offset vectors for all the instances, whether they belong to an instance with or without annotation. However, first of all, I think we by ourselves have by now quite a good intuition about how a good vector field looks like. So if our network would provide us with a vector field like this, we would intuitively say that this is a good vector field since the offset vectors point towards a specific centroid. On the contrary, if the network would provide us with a vector field like this or like this, we would intuitively say that these are bad vector fields, since on the left side the offset vectors are kind of pointing away from a centroid, and on the right side we have some rotational behavior which is also not desired. And it turns out that these intuitions about the vector field are well defined by two mathematical operators, which are namely the divergence and the curl, that take as input a 2D vector field and provide us as output with a scalar field that describes a certain behavior of the given vector field. And we can just start by applying the divergence to some illustrative vector fields. So when we apply this operator to the vector field at the top left, where the offset vectors are pointing away from a centroid, so they are diverging, then the divergence is positive. If the offset vectors point towards a specific centroid, so they are converging, then the divergence is negative. And if there's no divergence or convergence in our vector field, the divergence is just 0. On the contrary, the curl describes the rotational behavior of a vector field, and if there is a counterclockwise rotation, the curl is positive. If there's a clockwise rotation, the curl is negative, and if there's no rotation at all, the curl is just 0. And we can also explicitly compute these operators for a given two-dimensional vector field, which are just defined as some simple operations on the partial derivatives of the given vector field. And now that we are aware of these operators, the next question is which values should we obtain for the divergence and curl for the vector field that we would like to obtain here. And for this we can just start by assuming a perfect vector field where all the offset vectors point directly towards the centroid of their associated instance, which is what we want to achieve specifically when using partial annotations, and then compute the divergence and curl of this vector field to see what the target values are that we are looking for. And when we compute the divergence of this vector field, we can see that both partial derivatives are mainly equal to -1, and since the divergence is just the sum of them, we obtain mainly values of -2. However, we also see that there are some outliers, specifically in the transition areas of overlapping plant instances, and these are areas where the offset vectors point into opposite directions, and thus the divergence is quite high, so this is an expected behavior. And similarly, for the curl, both partial derivatives are mainly equal to 0, and thus the curl itself is also 0, and we have again a few outliers in the transition areas of overlapping plant instances, which is here expected. And now that we have the target values for the divergence and curl, the final question is how can we exploit this information during training when using partial annotations. And specifically during training, we can just compare the divergence of our currently predicted vector field with the target values of the divergence by defining a robust regression loss function that we can then minimize to encourage our network to predict a vector field with the desired behavior regarding its divergence. And we can compute this penalty for all the offset vectors, whether they belong to an instance with or without annotation, so this is really well suited for partial annotations. So for example, This area here belongs to an area without annotation, and our currently predicted vector field will have a divergence that does not match the target values for the divergence, so we will have a high loss here. And similarly for the curl, we also define a robust regression loss function, but of course here the target values are different. And when we now include these additional loss functions during training, we obtain a new model with a new set of parameters, and when we deploy this new model, we can see that the predicted offset vectors generalize much better than before. And this means for the annotated instances, the situation has not changed, but now also for the instances without annotation, we obtain proper offset vectors that point towards a specific centroid, and as a result of this, also the spatial embeddings form again well-defined clusters in two-dimensional space, which means we can again apply our post-processing procedure here, which results in well-defined plant instances. And again, we see this not only qualitatively, but also quantitatively when we compare to different baselines. And for this, let us first investigate the performance of a conventionally trained model that was trained with a quarter of all annotations in the PhenoBench dataset. And we can see that the performance of the conventional model is quite low compared to an upper bound, where the upper bound represents a model that was trained with all annotations available. On the contrary, when we deploy our model, also trained with a quarter of all annotations, we can see that it performs much better, and the gap to the upper bound is actually already quite close. In addition, when we compare to 3 other baselines that also try to train models with highly reduced set of annotations, we can see that our model performs superior. Now, to summarize panoptic segmentation, I presented a method to automatically group pixels belonging to plant instances by using offset vectors, and we contribute here by novel loss functions based on the divergence and curl that enable the use of partial annotations, and this effectively reduces the annotation bottleneck for panoptic segmentation. And now that we have a reliable model for panoptic segmentation, we can move towards our last method that tackles the task of hierarchical segmentation, where we additionally segment individual leaf instances of crops that are highlighted here by differently colored masks. And before we discuss how we can design a model to obtain such predictions, I would like to explain first in more detail why we are interested in this information in the first place. And for this, we need to talk about the so-called BBC-H scale, which is a standardized system in agriculture used to describe the phenological development stages of individual plants. And more specifically, as shown in the illustration, this scale categorizes plant development into different stages, ranging from germination to harvesting, where each stage is defined by a specific BBC-H code. And based on these codes, key farming activities like fertilization, pest control, and harvesting are scheduled by farmers or breeders to ensure that any in-field intervention is on time and also effective. And it turns out that the BBC-H code of a plant correlates highly with its total number and size of leaves, which is the reason why we are interested in segmenting all leaf instances of individual crops. Now, conceptually, from the perspective of the model, we address this task here quite similar as before, by also predicting a two-dimensional vector field where the offset vectors point now towards the centroid of their associated leaf instance. We can then recover individual leaf instances as before by shifting each pixel along its predicted offset vector, which results in spatial leaf embeddings, illustrated by pink dots, which we can then pass to a clustering algorithm to recover individual leaf instances. And while this enables us here to segment individual leaf instances of crops, we do so far not know which leaf instance belongs to which plant instance, which is essential to determine the BBC-H code on a per plant level. And to solve this issue, we extend the output of our second decoder by predicting an additional two-dimensional vector field that predicts offset vectors which shift the previously computed spatial leaf embeddings towards the centroid of their associated plant. So when we apply these offset vectors, we obtain spatial plant embeddings that are an accumulation of all the leaf embeddings belonging to this plant. And by this approach, we consider the hierarchy of a plant, where we model each plant explicitly as the union of its associated leaves. Now, the vector fields shown so far are all just illustrative. However, to convince you that we can actually train a model that considers this hierarchy in its predicted vector fields, we can see here the training process of such a model, where all the offset vectors are just 0 at the very beginning. On the left side, we see the predicted vector fields for leaves, and on the right side for plants. And when we start the iterative training, we can see that the offset vectors of leaves point more and more towards their desired centroid, and the offset vectors of plant pull the associated leaf embeddings more and more towards a specific plant centroid. As before, after some time, we fix the model parameters and deploy the model on new incoming images, where we can see here some qualitative results for predicted leaf and plant instances of our model. And a nice property of our method is that the predicted masks for leaves and plants are consistent due to the hierarchy that we consider here. This means here that a single identified leaf can by design only belong to a single plant. And this is in contrast to other approaches that try to identify leaves and plants more independently and do not consider this hierarchy. Here, the predicted mask can be inconsistent. For example, for another approach, this leaf here is correctly identified, but at the same time, this method identifies for pixels of this leaf two different plant instances, which makes conceptually no sense and cannot happen with our model due to the considered hierarchy. This is also something that we can see quantitatively when we compare our method that considers the hierarchy to another approach that does not consider the hierarchy, where our method achieves a higher performance for crop leaves, but also for crop plants. Now, to summarize hierarchical segmentation, I presented here an approach that represents each plant as the union of its associated leaves by considering a certain hierarchy, and we contribute here by embedding this hierarchy explicitly in the predictions of the network, and this enables us to determine plant development stages in an automated fashion. Finally, to conclude my contributions to vision-based semantic scene understanding for agricultural robots, I developed in my thesis several automated methods that in sum provide a holistic understanding of entire agricultural fields, and this enables applications for sustainable agriculture. We started with semantic segmentation, where we exploit images without manual annotations to substantially improve the generalization capabilities of such models. Continued with panoptic segmentation, where we highly reduced the amount of required annotations by exploiting the divergence and curl. And finished with hierarchical segmentation, where we exploit the hierarchical structure of plants to jointly segment leaves and plants. Here is also a list of my publications that resulted in 5 journal publications, 1 conference paper, and 4 collaborations. And with this, I would like to thank you for your attention, and I'm open to take any questions.